In New York in the 1980s, the emergence of crack cocaine brought a new wave of violence. Drug dealers robbed and killed as they scrambled for power. Ordinary citizens were victimized. Even children were not immune. The FBI joined forces with the New York City police to take back the streets. Their best weapon against deadly drug gangs was the C-11 squad.
New York City is no stranger to gang violence. But when a 12-year-old child was kidnapped, the gangs had crossed the line. Law enforcement raced to find the missing boy before it was too late. I'm Jim Kallstrom, former head of the FBI's New York office. Agents would have to infiltrate the secretive world of a vicious gang to stop the murderous exploits of a drug lord.
In the 1980s, crack cocaine invaded the Harlem section of New York, as it did many urban areas in America. Over time, the cheap and highly addictive drug crippled communities unlike any other drug had before. With the crack came ruthlessly violent gangs that ruled the streets. No one was truly safe. On December 5th, 1989, 12-year-old Donnell Porter was walking to elementary school alone. He never made it to class that day. When he didn't arrive home after school, his family worried. They hadn't been able to find him in the neighborhood. At 9 p.m., Donnell's sister received a phone call.
Yeah.
A man on the other end said Donnell had been kidnapped. He wanted $500,000 or the boy would be killed.
Inside the men's bathroom.
The sister said the family didn't have that kind of money. It didn't matter to the caller.
Yeah.
He warned them not to contact police, then instructed them to go to a restaurant at 125th and Broadway. Behind a trash can in the restroom, they'd find something that would prove he was serious.
You got it?
A family friend went to the restaurant so the Porters could stay by the phone. He didn't know if it was a setup. Following the kidnapper's orders, he checked behind the trash container and found a coffee can. Inside were 2 rings, an audio cassette, and a child's severed finger. Donnell was hurt and could be bleeding to death. Despite being warned not to, the family called the New York City police.
Following you, looking at you, nobody standing around.
The family told investigators what they knew. Detectives inspected the evidence. The sister said that the rings belonged to Donnell. They'd been given to the boy by his older brother. On the tape, a recorded plea for help was definitely Donnell's voice. The family told detectives about a second call in which the kidnapper had lowered his ransom to $350,000. It was still far beyond their means. They said they didn't know why they were targeted for such a high ransom. But detectives knew what the family wouldn't say.
So you came straight back.
The victim's older brother, Richard Porter, was a major crack cocaine dealer in the area. Police believe the kidnapping was related to his drug empire. NYPD contacted the New York FBI's reactive squad for assistance. Special Agent David Higgins, a narcotics expert, was asked to provide more intelligence on Richard Porter.
Anything they have, any of them. Richard Porter, then about 25 years of age, was a well-known crack dealer whose activities took place in central Harlem. He was one of those individuals who got in early on the crack trade in New York, and he had created a significant drug empire in central Harlem.
Richard Porter had made millions of dollars selling crack on New York's streets. Detectives knew where his turf was.
What's going on, man?
It didn't take long to find Porter. Detectives recognized the person he was with as his drug-running partner, Alpo Martinez. This visit wasn't about drugs. It was about finding Donnell. Porter agreed to come to the station for an interview, though he said he didn't know how he could help.
Look, guys, I don't know anything.
Police knew Porter was very close to Donnell, but he claimed to know nothing about who was behind his brother's kidnapping. On the streets, these matters are usually solved without the cops.
I don't know no one.
Though Porter most likely held the key to finding Donnell, he was in no position to talk to authorities.
Richard Porter, because of his situation as a drug trafficker, found himself in a ticklish situation legally. It would have been difficult for him to cooperate directly with law enforcement. I believe he attempted to handle this situation on his own to some extent.
Police had nothing to hold him on. Authorities needed to find someone else to help them. They canvassed the area, trying to gather information on the kidnapping. In such a close-knit neighborhood, someone had to have heard something about Donnell. But residents were too afraid to talk. Harlem's violent gangs had a stranglehold on the community. Detectives were left with nothing. With each passing day, police in NYPD's 32nd precinct knew Donnell's chance of survival decreased. Investigators maintained contact with the boy's family, who were desperate for more word from the kidnappers.
We need to get to the bottom of this. Take a
A
look
week
at that.
after the abduction, the family received a note. In it, the kidnappers hinted Donnell was still alive.
The child is in pain.
They demanded their money.
Assistance.
We gotta do something genetic.
But no more ransom calls came. With no clues to the boy's whereabouts and no one talking, police had reached a dead end. They somehow needed to pressure Richard Porter into
We gotta
cooperating,
get him back in here.
or hope he would pay the ransom to get Donnell back. Then, on January 4th, 1990, a month after Donnell's abduction, the body of his brother, drug kingpin Richard Porter, was found in a Bronx park. He had been shot twice, in the head and chest. There would be no one to pay the ransom now.
It was widely assumed that Richard's death was connected to the kidnapping and probably the result of a ransom payment gone bad. However, it was noted early on that when his body was discovered, his wallet contained over $2,000 in U.S. currency. His jewelry was there. Apparently his automobile was nearby. So there was some question about what the actual motivations were behind his murder.
We got a little boy's missing fingers.
With Richard Porter's death, investigators lost their closest connection to the abducted 12-year-old. To find another source, they increased pressure on lower-level dealers in Porter's organization. Facing drug charges, they were offered leniency in exchange for information. Some said Porter's partner, Alpo Martinez, could be involved. Others claimed an infamous Harlem gang called the Preacher Crew might be. But none offered direct leads to the crime. 3 weeks later, a boy's body was recovered in the same Bronx park where Richard Porter was found. His family identified the body of Donnell Porter. Cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head.
The death of a child is always a disturbing event. There's a 12-year-old boy, he's on the way to public school. He's kidnapped, tortured. He's heard on the tape cassette crying for help from his family.
Donnell's murder stunned the entire Harlem community, even though violence was a daily occurrence there. At the time, Sergeant James Marr worked NYPD's notorious 32nd Precinct, where Donnell lived.
In the late 80s and the early 90s, the 32nd Precinct, which is actually geographically only 1 square mile, was one of the most violent precincts in New York City. They averaged in the area of the upper 60s to low 70s of homicides a year, and added on to that were shootings, several hundred shootings, that the people didn't die.
In response to the increased violence in the city, a task force called the C-11 Squad had been formed at the FBI's New York field office. Detectives from the 32nd Precinct and FBI agents were assigned to the squad.
C-11 was created to address these entrenched criminal conspiracy groups in the city of New York. The locals brought their knowledge of the streets, the knowledge of the subjects involved to the table. The federal agents brought along with them the access to the federal courts, which included the access to the federal sentencing guidelines in the United States Attorney's Office.
After the murder of Donnell Porter, they knew they had to take back the streets. C-11 would first go after Alpo Martinez, Richard Porter's partner.
The problem is here, we haven't
If their
identified the
partnership
other
had
members of the
unraveled,
crew yet.
he would have had the most to gain from extorting Richard Porter and killing him.
We're still working on some surveillance.
A year earlier, a warrant had been sworn out for his arrest on drug charges. But when Martinez couldn't be found, federal prosecutors had to drop the warrant. In police computers, the C-11 Squad flagged the names of known associates of Alpo Martinez. If any were arrested, they would be notified. Months later, police in Washington, D.C. pulled over a car after observing its driver engage in a drug deal. The driver was a known courier for Alpo Martinez. Police found a large amount of crack and thousands of dollars in his car. Noting the flag on his record from New York, D.C. authorities would contact the C-11 Squad. After the courier was sentenced to 20 years to life on drug charges, C-11 agents had him transported to New York for an interview.
I want some information about him because we want...
An agent explained that under federal law, his sentence could be reviewed if he cooperated with authorities.
You're just making this difficult on yourself. Where does he... All I know...
He told what he knew about Martinez and Porter's East Coast drug operation.
Drugs would be distributed both in New York City by Richard Porter and in Washington, D.C. by Alpo Martinez. While in Washington, D.C., Martinez allied himself with individuals that he found to be strong on the street, if you will, in order to protect his drug operation in Washington, D.C. And it was not unusual for literally sea bags worth of U.S. currency to be shipped out of Northern Virginia and Washington, D.C. up into the Porter neighborhood at 132nd and 7th Avenue in New York City.
It was enough for a renewed arrest warrant on Alpo Martinez. Agents canvassed the neighborhood, talking to people who knew Martinez. Most were afraid to talk. Eventually, agents learned the fugitive was going to pick up his wife's car at a dealership in northern New Jersey. Undercover agents staked out the dealership. They didn't know if Martinez would show up, but they knew he liked fast cars. That afternoon, a sports car pulled up. They watched a passenger get out, but it wasn't Martinez.
There he goes. He's going over to the building. I'm coming over.
Agents couldn't tell if the fugitive was driving.
Can you see him?
They had to risk a closer look. If they could arrest Martinez, it might help solve the murders of Richard Porter and his 12-year-old brother, Donnell. An agent visually identified Martinez as the driver. He radioed a go-ahead signal. But before the arrest team could respond, Martinez spun away. Agents gave chase, but the fugitive disappeared into heavy traffic. With Alpo Martinez still a fugitive, the abduction and murder of 12-year-old Donnell Porter remained unsolved. The abduction and murder of 12-year-old Donnell Porter showed that Harlem's drug violence was out of control. The FBI's C-11 squad knew the murder was connected to the boy's brother, crack dealer Richard Porter. But Porter himself had been killed. C-11 believed finding Porter's partner, Alpo Martinez, would provide answers. But in 1991, Martinez had eluded an FBI undercover operation. From the incident, the FBI got his license plate number and alerted New York police to be on the lookout for the vehicle. The next day, police spotted it, parked on a Harlem street. They impounded it, hoping it might lead to Martinez. They believed the fugitive wouldn't retrieve the vehicle himself, but FBI Special Agent David Higgins waited to see if he'd send someone.
A young lady showed up who claimed to be the true owner. She was the registered owner. Ultimately, a quick investigation established that she was what we call a straw man, or somebody who had stepped forward in order to buy and register the car on behalf of Mr. Martinez.
Martinez was nowhere to be found in New York. Acting on a tip that he had traveled to Washington, D.C., agents set up surveillance at the D.C. home of the fugitive's ex-wife. In the early hours of November 7th, 1991, they spotted Martinez getting into his ex-wife's vehicle. This time, he wasn't driving. As they pulled out, the FBI made their move. The fugitive's ex-wife pulled over. The cocaine in his possession helped cement the case against one of the biggest drug traffickers on the East Coast.
Ultimately, Mr. Martinez pled guilty to an indictment in the Eastern District of Virginia, which accused him of trafficking in over 1,000 kilograms of cocaine. The wholesale value of that would be $20 million.
Richie Rich, who killed him?
Investigators also had evidence against Martinez on several gangland murders.
The little boy? Yeah, I don't know nothing about that.
They told him they knew he was Richard Porter's partner, so he stood to gain from Donnell's and Richard's death. Hoping to avoid the death penalty, Alpo Martinez agreed to cooperate.
I mean, he cheated.
What happened?
I picked him up.
He admitted killing his partner, Richard Porter.
You know, just like we always do on the weekend or whatever. It didn't seem like
Martinez had begun to suspect his partner had been cheating him out of hundreds of thousands of dollars.
So then from there,
He said that more than a year earlier, on January 4th, 1990, he and an associate had taken Richard Porter for a ride. Almost immediately, Martinez and the associate each shot him. They dumped his body in the Bronx Park, where it was found the next day.
talking about it, kill my kid. I don't know.
Martinez swore it was just about missing drug money.
Yo, I didn't kill no
It had
dog
nothing to
now.
do with Donnell Porter's kidnapping and murder. No evidence or testimony linked Martinez to that crime. He went to prison for life. Although they had put away a major drug dealer, the local and federal investigators of the C-11 squad were no closer to solving the murder of Donnell Porter. They reviewed FBI intelligence already gathered on other Harlem gangsters who might have profited from extorting and killing Richard Porter.
Porter's known as Richie Rich. We've got a couple of characters.
One gang stood out as likely suspects.
Haven't identified their physique. That's one of the
They were known as the Preacher Crew.
and hitmen.
The gang's leader was Clarence Preacher Heatley. FBI Special Agent Joe Walsh, formerly of the C-11 squad, knew the Preacher and his crew were well entrenched and very dangerous.
Preacher crew was the established crew in the neighborhood, for a long time. Preacher had been kicking around the streets of Harlem since the early 70s, and everybody knew him by his nickname, the Black Hand of Death, and everybody was deathly afraid of him.
NYPD Sergeant James Marr of the C-11 squad learned the Preacher had a reputation for violence. But the gangster was an elusive figure in Harlem.
You could walk up to anybody in the 32nd precinct, no matter how church-going they are, no matter whether they're businessmen or local drug dealers, they all have a Preacher story. They all know who Preacher is. Ask any of them to describe Preacher to you, or a majority of them, they're not going to be able to. Because this guy was an infamous legend in Harlem.
The players in Harlem's drug underworld had carved up the area into zones. Each block, each alley was the established turf of a single dealer. Most dealers respected the boundaries. But the Preacher did not. He considered all of Harlem his turf. He made his money not by dealing drugs, but by taxing other dealers.
But he was mostly into extortion, extorting drug dealers. These are guys that were violent in their own right. He would go up and claim their car. If a drug dealer looked like he was getting paid, so to say, he was driving a brand new full-size Mercedes-Benz, and Preacher liked that car, that was Preacher's.
Those who argued with Preacher paid a heavy price. It was a system that made him a rich man.
If you're hitting every other drug dealer on the streets, 2,000 here, 3,000 here, 5,000 there, that's a lot of money. It adds up. And believe me, they all paid, because if they didn't pay, Preacher would pay him a visit, or he would order his people to pay him a visit, and they'd wind up dead.
Here we took him in last week.
The Preacher's history of extortion and violence made him a likely suspect in the abduction and murder of Donnell Porter.
John Cuff.
C-11 had outlined the
And
basic
we're also
structure of
working
the
on a
Preacher
couple other
crew.
pictures, including some of his other main guys in his crew.
The Preacher's main lieutenant was a man named John Cuff. He was a particularly dangerous criminal, according to C-11's detective Vinnie Flynn.
John Cuff was an ex-New York City housing cop. As a cop, he provided protection and bodyguard work for Preacher. So if they were driving through the neighborhood and were stopped, John Cuff had a shield where he would probably be let go and not given a summons or anything further would happen. John Cuff had a reputation of one to be feared, very violent person.
Yet no evidence linked either man to Donnell Porter. Though C-11 suspected Preacher was involved in the deadly kidnapping, he probably didn't commit it himself. He distanced himself from most of the crimes, having his main lieutenant and other henchmen carry out his orders.
I know you got so much. I know you got so much, man.
At Preacher's command, their brutal extortion tactics earned them money and kept witnesses too intimidated to talk, effectively insulating the crew against investigation.
We go into a bodega or someplace up in Harlem, and we'd say, we know he came in here, and the guy would have a cast on his hand. We know he broke your hand, and the shop owner would say, I don't know what you're talking about, and that shop owner would be paying rent, or tax to Preacher, but nobody would tell us anything.
With people too afraid to talk, crimes continued to pile up. On New Year's Eve, 1992, emergency units responded to a call in the Preacher's territory. A man lay dead in his car, the victim of a drive-by shooting. His family survived the harrowing ordeal. They described how the killers pulled up next to them on the street and opened fire. They claimed they didn't know who did it or why. And like Donnell's kidnapping, no one in the neighborhood admitted seeing anything. It was another tragic killing in Harlem that might go unsolved. The C-11 squad had to breach the area's violently enforced code of silence and finally get insiders to talk. A shocking drive-by shooting was added to the list of unsolved murders in Harlem. With witnesses too afraid to cooperate with police, the case was open for 2 years. Then in 1994, the C-11 squad found a witness who told them the shooter was a Preacher crew member named Malik. Detective Vinnie Flynn learned that Malik had a violent reputation.
He became a so-called director of security for the Preacher organization. He was in charge of the group of members who were known as the janitors. The janitors were the people that had to clean up the problems or the mess of the family. And you couldn't be a janitor unless you killed somebody.
To get more on Malik and the Preacher crew, C-11 tried to send in undercover officers. It was yet another dead end, according to FBI Special Agent Joe Walsh.
We weren't able to really get in, so to speak, and get an undercover in there to buy narcotics from Preacher, because Preacher was very, very careful. He was, he's a very smart man, and we couldn't get the undercover, close to him.
The Preacher had closed ranks, ordering the people he extorted not to sell to new buyers and to keep a low profile on the street. Investigators needed a witness with close ties to the crew. They distributed business cards, hoping one would find its way to an insider willing to talk. Their persistence paid off. In April 1994, a crew member contacted the C-11 squad because he realized his life was in danger. He said the preacher had started going after his own crew members. Preacher had killed 2 of the informant's partners. Fearing he was next, he asked Sergeant James Marr for protection.
It was a stone-cold killer himself who became an informant that was so fearful of Preacher and of being killed like his partners had that he came to me, that he came to us, that he gave us information on specific crimes, that he talked about crimes that had been unsolved for years.
Investigators were frustrated that the informant knew nothing of 12-year-old Donnell Porter's kidnapping and murder. But he did give investigators their first specific insider information about Preacher Heatley's organization. He mentioned a killing basement that the crew used as a meeting place and execution chamber.
Talk to me.
At some meetings, Preacher would call for a vote on the fate of gang members who had fallen out of favor.
Killer.
If the majority voted thumbs down, Preacher ordered a murder. In March 1994, Preacher called for a vote on Malik, the janitor who had done the drive-by shooting. He believed Malik could no longer be trusted. The vote was thumbs down.
Yeah, what's up?
Preacher summoned Malik to headquarters.
How y'all doing? All right, most love, man. Most love, man. Most love. How you doing? I ain't seen you in a long time. What you been at, man? Most love. Know it, man. How it is?
Malik thought he was there to take part in the beating of a crew member that he had had problems with in the past.
Jay, I know he's slinging, man. All right? Word.
Not realizing he was the real target, Malik was excited when others invited him to the basement.
Playing around.
If you went down there and you were followed in there, you know, somebody was behind you, you weren't coming out alive.
Yo, Sean, let's go get this dude, Sean. Let's go get him. We're gonna do this to you, baby. We're gonna do this to you. Yo, oh shit. Priest, what's up, man? What's up, man? What's up? What you doing? Oh, man. Yo, Preach, man, come on, man.
Preacher told Malik he had to die. He was gaining too much influence within the organization. Preacher wouldn't tolerate it. Malik pleaded for his life. But the order had been given.
Grab the saw, Sean. Clean him up.
At Preacher's command, other janitors used a circular saw to dismember Malik. The informant said that Preacher ordered him and another crew member to dispose of the body parts.
This is the guy you work for, right?
They poured acid on Malik's arms to remove gang tattoos that could link him to the crew. Then they left the body parts in several crumbling, abandoned buildings.
They kept Malik's head in a refrigerator for a couple of weeks, and they kind of paraded it around on a stick. You know, that's how Preacher would, keep the fear of God, so to speak, in the younger Turks in his organization.
The fear was too much for the informant, though he knew leaving the crew was equivalent to a death sentence. He hoped the C-11 squad could protect him. It didn't take long for word to get back to the Preacher that the informant had cooperated. One day, the informant was leaving a New York courthouse when he spotted Preacher in cuff. He was sure they were there to abduct and kill him. He went to his car and called his C-11 handlers.
The informant advised me that his fear that he was going to be killed by the organization, he was going to be abducted, right in the middle of the afternoon in front of the courthouse.
The agents of C-11 rushed to stop another murder in the preacher's territory.
I'm scared to death.
A former member of the preacher crew feared the gang was out to kill him for cooperating with authorities. Agents and detectives from the FBI C-11 squad came to his aid just in time. They arrested Maine Lieutenant John Cuff and the crew leader himself, Clarence Preacher Heatley. Sergeant James Marr and the other arresting agents searched the vehicle.
There was evidence inside, including information about my informant, masks, tape. It was apparent at the time that my informant's feelings were right. He was going to be abducted that day.
Come on, man.
But no one could prove that the men were coming to kill the informant.
20 minutes, all it took. I told you.
The preacher and Cuff were released.
Come on, man. I got things to do, man. Hurry up.
Okay, got some
The
glasses.
incident brought the C-11 squad's investigation of the crew into the open.
20 minutes, all it took.
Have a nice day.
Nice day, officer.
That's when it became apparent that they were being investigated by the FBI. I mean, here's this detective that they know from the 3-2, that when he does make an arrest, makes arrests with FBI agents. It became apparent to Cuff and Preacher that the FBI was breathing down their neck.
Preacher further insulated himself. The FBI would have to get him by going after his organization. To prosecute, they would use federal racketeering statutes known as RICO. Originally designed to bring down organized crime families, RICO requires that strict criteria are met, according to FBI Special Agent Joe Walsh.
You have to have your organization. You have to have your leader, which in this case was Preacher, and he has to have 5 or more people working underneath him, you know, to facilitate the conspiracy of the organization. But you also need 3 predicate offenses, 3 federal offenses.
The C-11 investigators surveilled the Preacher crew, gathering evidence on offenses to support the RICO case. They noticed unrest within the gang. It seemed the pressure of C-11's investigation was getting to the Preacher. From an informant, agents learned he even ordered the murder of his Maine lieutenant, John Cuff. Agents were obligated to warn Cuff of the hit.
I reached for my shield. He goes, "I know who you are. You don't have to show me your shield." I said, "You know, John, I just want to let you know that there's a contract out in your life, and I swear there's nothing but space when you look in his eyes." And he goes, "Everybody wants me dead."
Coming in, man. Come on, man.
Cuff was undaunted by the threat. Though the Preacher was tightening his grip on his men, investigators still needed to get evidence of the crimes the crew committed to support the racketeering organization. As more buyers and sellers were arrested, some agreed to cooperate, helping to outline the group in detail, according to Detective Vinnie Flynn.
We obtained informants through narcotics investigations, arrests made by the 3-2 precinct and the 3-2 detective squad, through information they developed and informants they developed. Because of arrest, information was compiled, which built a case against the Preacher crew.
About some murders. What murders do you know about?
Unfortunately, no one had information on the Donnell Porter murder.
There was this girl who went to the park, you know, and so we took her back.
But one arrested crew member offered details of another murder committed by the crew, hoping for leniency. He said they decided they didn't want to pay for a shipment of drugs.
I don't know.
They told the supplier that a young woman had stolen them and that they would take care of her. She was a single mother who sometimes worked as a courier for the crew.
So, did you see them black?
They brought her to a Harlem apartment, telling her they wanted her to hear a record they had produced.
Look it up.
She hadn't stolen any drugs. That didn't matter to the crew.
Anything about a kid?
The informant explained how they cleaned up the crime scene, then dumped the body in an abandoned building. He couldn't remember exactly which building it was. In August 1996, after more than 5 years of meticulous investigation, the U.S. Attorney's Office of the Southern District of New York decided they had enough for indictments and arrests on federal RICO charges. The first indictment was against Clarence Preacher Heatley and John Cuff. The indictment was kept sealed. If word got out to the preacher, he might disappear forever. Investigators staked out Preacher's Harlem headquarters. They hoped news of the indictments hadn't been leaked, and that if they found him, they could arrest him without a fight. They knew Preacher was surrounded by armed men, willing to kill at his command. In late 1996, the C-11 squad was ready to arrest Clarence Preacher Heatley. No one had seen him in days. On August 12th, he emerged from his headquarters building. Detectives made sure he was alone, then moved in.
Preacher, drop the phone! Drop the phone! Drop the phone! Let me see your hands! Get down now! Get on the car! Get on the car! Get on the car! Hands on the car! Hands on the car!
As he was arrested, the elusive gang leader remained relaxed and confident. As soon as he was in custody, other teams arrested his main lieutenant, John Cuff. 2 months later, 15 more Preacher crew members were indicted. Arrest teams prepared for simultaneous takedowns. They had to strike fast, full force, to arrest gang members safely. Detective Vinnie Flynn and other C-11 investigators developed more cooperating witnesses among the arrested crew members.
Once people were arrested and being prosecuted, they agreed to cooperate, and they felt that they were used by the Preacher crew, and felt that if, in some cases, if they didn't participate, they would have been killed too. So this was their way out of the Preacher crew and from under Clarence Heatley's control.
Investigators learned in which Harlem buildings the crew dumped some of their victims. Finding physical evidence was crucial in order to prosecute the RICO case. One building was a shell, partially collapsed on the inside, further complicating the retrieval. After days of excavating tons of rubble, a body was discovered. Lab examiners determined it was the body of the young mother who had been killed as a cover for stolen drugs. She had been shot in an apartment in an adjacent building. Evidence response teams checked the apartment.
That's the apartment where they kept the Malik's head. And in the refrigerator, there was a lot of blood still left in the apartment. And inside the refrigerator, there was Malik's blood from where they kept his head. They were able to trace that at the lab.
Malik and several others had been killed in the basement of the Preacher's headquarters. Crime scene technicians processed the basement. Arrested crew members said Preacher had them scrub the place with boric acid after each killing. Most of the basement was clean.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, there you go, right there.
But technicians were able to recover traces of blood on the windows and on the saw blade that had been used to dismember Malik. But the investigation was not over. The abduction and murder of young Donnell Porter was still unsolved.
Come on in, gentlemen. Have a seat.
Answers about his death finally came from an unlikely source.
Money for what?
An assistant district attorney convinced the boys' uncle, Preacher crew member John Apple Porter, to come in to talk.
We were driving, right. Okay. You jumped out the side van. Pull him in through.
He was one of the crew's main players left on the street and had been labeled a snitch. 2 attempts had been made on his life. The DA suggested that Porter cooperate to earn protection in prison. He confessed to several murders and revealed what happened to his nephew Donnell.
Who grabbed it? Y'all both?
According to Sergeant James Marr, the kidnapping was prompted by jealousy and greed.
The underlying factor with Johnny Porter, Johnny Apples, with the kidnapping was when he came home from prison, Richie Porter, his nephew, was this big Harlem drug dealer. He was getting paid. Richie Porter used to wear a lot of gold, used to really like flashy cars. He was making a lot of money, and he wasn't giving any to Johnny Porter. And Johnny Porter felt he was owed this, and he decided to take it. And the way he took it is he snatched the kid.
Porter said the preacher agreed to the kidnapping. He sent one of his janitors, Malik, to help. They believed Richard Porter would pay anything to get his brother back.
No.
They kept the boy in a basement where no one would hear him.
What's up, Shorty? We'll make a tape for us.
They cut off his finger and recorded the boy's pleas for help to prove to his family they were serious. Apple and Preacher hoped for $500,000, enough to set Apple up in his own drug trade and enough to cripple Richard Porter.
What time was it?
When Richard couldn't come up with that amount of cash, they lowered it to $350,000.
Did you hold that in his hand?
Then the unexpected happened. Preacher and Apple learned that Richard Porter was murdered. There'd be no ransom.
You sure about that?
Make the call.
Preacher Heatley later told Special Agent Joe Walsh about his decision.
Preacher sat right down in a room and told me exactly what happened. He looked me right in the eye and said, "You know, I couldn't let that boy live after what had happened."
Yeah.
John Porter insisted that it was Malik who actually did the killing. Malik was later killed and dismembered at the preacher's command.
You're gonna think twice about it.
John Porter was sentenced to natural life. Because of the evidence collected by the C-11 squad, each member of the preacher crew went to prison. Their leader, Clarence Preacher Heatley, pled guilty to federal racketeering charges that included drug trafficking, assault, and murder. He was sentenced to life with no chance of parole. He and his crew will never again terrorize the streets of Harlem.
It's estimated that they're responsible for approximately 45 murders that we're aware of. Numerous robberies. If you add the extortion in, these people were a decade-long or better crime wave in themselves. They were just amazing, the devastation that they caused in these communities.
That changed when the C-11 squad dismantled the preacher crew forever. Since the case was closed, Harlem has seen a rebirth.
Harlem today, the 32nd precinct, is running somewhere between 15 and 20 homicides a year, down from the 70s. down from 70 a year in the late 80s during the crack cocaine binge. I think we accomplished quite a bit with this case. And the drug organization doesn't exist anymore, so we can't hurt anybody else.
3 mysterious deaths in a Florida river confound local authorities. The preliminary investigation reveals little. But when police and the FBI find a sinister link to international drug smuggling, they uncover a conspiracy of unbridled greed and ruthless violence. It's a case that thrusts an entire city into chaos.
In the 1980s, thousands of violent criminals flooded into America from Cuba and Colombia. Drugs hit South Florida, and the area, bloated with illicit wealth, became a violent powder keg. I'm Jim Kallstrom, former head of the FBI's New York office. In the bloody Miami drug wars, the winners got rich, the losers buried, and everyone was a target.
Colombia, South America. Until the 1970s, life was simple but hard. Then, a failed economy gave way to a sharp rise in drug trafficking. The drug trade caused stiff competition that literally began to rip the country apart. Ruthless Colombian drug lords began consolidating their businesses into partnerships known as cartels. Death came to anyone who got in their way. As the cartel's influence grew, so did the American appetite for illicit drugs. And Miami became the prime point of entry for most of the cocaine smuggled into the country. And with it came bloodshed. Colombian assassins were sent to Miami to wipe out the local competition. The homicide rate grew to more than triple the national average for large cities. Miami was named the murder capital of the U.S. Former Metro-Dade homicide detective Alex Alvarez recalls how in 1979, violence came to a Miami shopping mall.
His date of birth is several drug traffickers bought out a step van, lined it with bulletproof vests and portholes, and did a drug hit in the parking lot and sprayed it with, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of rounds in the parking lot, trying to kill their intended target.
2 known drug traffickers were killed, and several innocent bystanders were wounded.
There were also incidents of high-speed pursuits on the expressway between 2 drug dealers that were just shooting it out on the expressway during rush hour traffic. And numerous people were being injured and killed. It was like the wild, wild west, so there was a need to try to curb and stop these drug traffickers who seemed to be out of control.
A special squad was formed to deal with the violence. Central Tactical Unit, or CENTAC 26, was headquartered at the Metro-Dade Police Department. Sergeant George Placencia was a detective assigned to the unit, the first of its kind in Miami.
It was a 26th one in the nation. The purpose of forming that task force was that we would go out and monitor all the homicides in Dade County and pick and choose the ones that we thought involved major drug traffickers and attempt to work that angle, the homicide angle, and dismantle the organization.
By the mid-1980s, constant pressure from law enforcement slowly changed the way drug traffickers were doing business in Miami.
They got a little bit more sophisticated. They still did the murders, but not the shootouts in public.
Drug traffickers went deep underground, organizing cells that excluded all but family and close friends. Many cells specialized in activities such as cocaine transportation, distribution, or money laundering. In only a few years, the business had become large and sophisticated, and still very deadly. On the afternoon of July 29, 1985, a marine salvager working on the Miami River noticed something. Off the bow of his boat, floating in the water, was a body. By the time Metro-Dade County Police responded, dock workers had pulled 2 more bodies from the river. The coroner examined the deceased for any signs of trauma or gunshot wounds. He found none. It appeared that the 3 had drowned. On the bodies, officers found beepers, Rolex watches, and plenty of cash. 2 were armed. Essentially, they were all carrying the tools of a drug smuggler. Metro-Dade police called Syntac 26. Sergeant Placencia investigated.
Yeah, hold on, let me write this down. How many people you got over there? We started doing area cams to see if anybody had seen anything suspicious or had seen these individuals prior to them meeting their demise, and that proved to be, not so fruitful at all. Nobody had seen anything.
The 3 victims were identified as local Cuban Americans. 2 had minor police records. The official cause of death was drowning, but there was no indication how they ended up in the water or why. Detective Alex Alvarez searched for a lead in the case.
We began running records checks and contacting the Drug Enforcement Administration to see if these people were known drug traffickers.
Agents at the DEA did not know the men, but they did have a source that could help.
Right. What's the address? They had an informant, and that informant knew the son of one of the dead people that were fished out of the Miami rivers, and it was definitely drug-related. And he was going to put us into contact with the son.
That afternoon, investigators paid a visit to the son.
You know why we're here,
He was willing to tell what he knew, hoping that the mystery of his father's death could be solved.
Can you tell us what you know and how you found out about it? Well, I know it's a really big business. He brings in thousands.
He told us that his father was one of the biggest drug smugglers in South Florida. He brought in thousands and thousands and thousands of pounds of cocaine.
Well, I know last Saturday
He said his father's crew used run-down, steel-hulled vessels to smuggle drugs into the country, since the old boats aroused less suspicion than big yachts.
He hadn't called later.
He also detailed how the smugglers built false bulkheads into the boats, concealing hidden compartments filled with hundreds and sometimes thousands of pounds of cocaine. When Customs searched these boats, their only hope of finding drugs would be to use a welding torch.
See, the smugglers are smart. They know that there's no way that Customs and the open ocean is going to put a torch to a boat, because if they're wrong, they'll sink the boat.
Now safely past Customs, the smugglers would continue to move their enormous cargo up the Miami River.
They would park at a marina and then let it sit there for 2 or 3 days to make sure there's no surveillance. And on the 2nd, 3rd, or 4th day, when they were convinced there was no surveillance, they'd come at the middle of the night, unload the drugs into vans, and ship them off to different locations within South Florida.
The son said he had been visited by 2 of his father's friends who were on board the ship the night his father drowned. They told him that the boat was raided by a group of gunmen dressed as cops.
So that's where your father was going that night.
The raiders threw the 6-man crew overboard and then stole about 450 kilos of cocaine.
Each kilo at that time was worth approximately $60,000. So the net retail value of this load was approximately $27 million. Now that's not the street value. The street value is probably 2-3 times that.
The son provided the names of all 3 men who survived, but said he didn't know how to contact them. The Centac detectives needed to find out if there had been a legitimate raid at the marina. They contacted every law enforcement agency in South Florida that handled drug cases.
None of them had any operations close to the boatyard where this incident happened. So at that time, when I canceled out that this was a legitimate raid, my next focus was, well, these people must have been phony cops, people impersonating police officers, because there was a trend at that time for people to dress up as police officers and raid drug dealers' homes and steal their cash and steal their drugs.
To check the victim's son's story, investigators went to the marina where the raid took place. They interviewed the security guard who had been on duty that night.
How are you?
He said that 7 or 8 men in police uniforms rushed the marina and headed for one of the boats.
They went right past the security guard. The security guard said, being South Florida, there's nothing unusual, you know, go at it.
He hadn't gotten a good look at any of them. Investigators later searched that boat, but found no clues. So they turned their attention to looking for the 3 men who had survived the raid. 2 of the 3 survivors had minor police records, but could not be located at their last known address. The next day, Centac 26 detectives played a hunch. They figured that the survivors would likely be going to the wake for one of the deceased victims.
So we showed up at the funeral home with the names and identities of the people who we were looking for.
The detectives were right. They recognized the survivors from arrest photos and approached the men as they entered. The men confirmed the boat was overrun by a group of raiders dressed like cops.
They're wearing blue uniforms.
But the men denied the boat was involved in drug running. They claimed they were simply having a party.
They had been drinking beer with the 3 victims and 2 additional friends. And while they were there drinking beer and having a good time, people in blue uniforms stormed past the front gate of the marina and started yelling, "Police, police."
The gunmen began assaulting them.
They said several friends were thrown in the water by these individuals dressed in blue uniforms.
Within minutes, all 6 men were overboard in the Miami River. But only 3 swam to safety. The investigation had now become a triple homicide. The Centac 26 detectives were convinced the raid was yet another instance of fake cops ripping off drug dealers. But again, the survivors denied that drugs were on the boat and insisted they did not know why the men attacked them. They said they didn't see any badge numbers of police cars, couldn't even tell which department the uniforms were from. With no detailed information from the 2 witnesses, the investigators were left without any significant leads. With the case stalled, the FBI offered their assistance. Special Agent Robert Martin.
At about the same time that the homicide investigation began regarding the 3 bodies found in the Miami River, an FBI cooperating witness provided some information to us regarding a group of police officers who were involved in some rip-offs. And he identified who those guys were, at least several of them, knew who some of them were, had conversations with them.
Detective Alvarez got an unexpected call from an agent in counterintelligence.
He says he needs to meet with us, that he has motive and possible information about our case. he put two and two together, so maybe this is related to this information that I'm getting through my informant, Armando Un. Now we can narrow down.
Armando Un, the FBI agent said, was a well-connected nightclub worker that knew about a group of crooked cops who were ripping off drug dealers along the Miami River. CENTAC 26 detectives went to see Armando Un. But he did not want to see them. The interview went nowhere. It would take the murder of a friend before Armando Un would talk. A motorist was driving through the Everglades. He spotted something that piqued his curiosity, a wooden box. He pulled over. To his horror, he found a body inside. He called police. Detectives from Miami-Dade's Drug Task Force, CENTAC 26, were investigating the deaths of 3 men found floating in the Miami River. They hoped an informant named Armando Un could help them. His friend and employer had been found murdered in the Florida Everglades. His name was Luis Rodriguez, the owner of a nightclub in Miami's Little Havana district. He'd been shot several times in the head and then stuffed in a box rigged to spring open. A gruesome display. Investigating for CENTAC 26 was Detective Alex Alvarez and Sergeant George Plasencia. They needed to get Armando Un to talk.
We never mentioned anything about the 3 bodies. Our ploy in speaking to him was that we were investigating the death of his best friend, the murder of his best friend.
According to Detective Plasencia, Armando Un was very candid.
We sat down and chatted with him for a while about Luis Rodriguez, and he said, yeah, Luis Rodriguez was involved in drug trafficking.
Would you recognize him? Do you know what
He admitted that Rodriguez was dealing drugs out of his nightclub and said he believed the men Rodriguez was involved with killed him.
And it's true that he was trafficking drugs.
He was furious that his friend had been murdered and said he wanted to help.
He was making money for everybody.
But if he knew about police officers, real or fake, robbing drug dealers, he said nothing.
He never mentioned that the police officers were involved. He did say that Luis Rodriguez was friendly with some officers.
Thank you very much. I appreciate
Armando Un seemed wary and selected his words carefully. When the interview ended, the detectives still had no suspects in the Miami River murders. All they really knew was that Luis Rodriguez was dead and may be the 4th drug murder victim in as many days. Then a City of Miami detective contacted Plasencia and Alvarez with a surprising lead. He said that Luis Rodriguez had also worked for him as a police informant.
He told us that Luis Rodriguez was giving him information about people who were dressed as police imposters and were ripping off drug dealers and committing murders in Dade County.
The detective explained that he had met Luis Rodriguez through a Miami patrol officer named Marco Rivera.
I said, we need your help now. I need you to set up a meeting between the street cop and George and I, and let's tell him that we're investigating Luis Rodriguez's murder. That'll be the cover story.
The meeting was set for that night at the Miami Police Department. Officer Ribeiro worked the late shift in 60 Sector, police code for Little Havana. He verified that he knew Luis Rodriguez and that Rodriguez had, on occasion, been his informant. But then, without prompting, he brought up the Miami River drownings.
He volunteered some information about the 3 bodies that were floating up in the Miami River. He said that these guys stole the drugs themselves, and when the owner of the drugs found out about it, had them murdered, or they were thrown in the water and drowned themselves, that there was no cops involved at all.
His denial that officers were involved, which no one had mentioned, seemed too forceful. The Centak 26 detectives tested him.
We asked this patrolman to repeat his story at the conclusion of our meeting, and we detected that this story didn't fit the first story that he had told us. There was something wrong there.
Rivera claimed a street source told him about the raid, so the detectives asked to speak directly with the source.
Yeah, I guess so. You know, just give me a call tomorrow. I'll try to contact him, and if I can't get in contact with him for any reason, I'll let you guys know.
For the Centak investigators, the case had taken a dramatic turn. This officer, sworn to uphold the law, seemed to be hiding something. The following day, Officer Marco Rivera introduced the detectives to the source who allegedly had information about the Miami River murders.
I don't know if I should even be talking to these guys. I don't even know, bro.
Rivera claimed his source could verify that drug-trafficking Colombians had carried out the raid, not Miami cops.
Hey, listen on, man. Hey, listen, we understand that.
But as the source spoke, he had a hard time remembering details of his story. Officer Rivera had to help him remember, according to Detective Alvarez.
The officer keeps having to correct him. No, it happened like this, and tell him about this, and he's filling in the blanks for this guy who's obviously been coached and cued on what to say. So we knew at that point, obviously, he was covering something up.
Officer Rivera's cover-up meant the detectives were faced with an even more serious problem. In case the deadly raiders were actually Miami police officers, they needed to be very careful.
This is a problem that we weren't really trained or focused in to investigate, which is, we're not internal affairs investigators. We don't investigate cops. That wasn't our role. That wasn't our job. But we were charged with the responsibilities of investigating these murders, and if these murders were committed by cops, they were fair play. We realized that if we were going to start to investigate cops, we'd have to do things very differently.
The Centak 26 detectives had to cover themselves. They asked the police chief to hold their personnel files as a precaution against internal leaks.
We did a lot of things to protect our identity and our family's identity. We took everything that we had in our names and took them out of our names so they couldn't trace where we lived and who we were. We're investigating. They're going to find out who we are. So right away, we built a wall between them and us.
Once they felt safe, Centak detectives began investigating the officers working the night shift in 60 Sector, Little Havana, Officer Marco Rivera's beat.
Sounds good. Okay.
With the chief's permission, Miami PD's internal affairs gave Centak 26 the personnel records for the officers in question.
Well, the City of Miami Internal Affairs Unit was very concerned. They were very cooperative. The names that we provided to them, they started looking into and giving us the backgrounds that they had on these individuals.
The investigators focused on a close-knit group of 8 officers, all relatively recent hires who joined the force at a time when Miami was in crisis. In the spring of 1980, Cuban President Fidel Castro had announced he would allow thousands of political refugees to seek asylum in foreign countries. The U.S. agreed to accept 3,500. Then, unexpectedly, Castro announced that for the first time in years, he would also allow American boats to enter Mariel Harbor. The result was what became known as the Mariel Boat Lift. More than 120,000 Cuban refugees flooded into South Florida, which overwhelmed Miami's ability to handle them. Most were hard-working immigrants looking for a chance at the American dream. Most, but not all.
10% of them was estimated were criminals that were dumped out of the prison system of Fidel Castro. So there was a spike in the crime wave in Miami-Dade County.
To stem the rising crime rate, the city had to hire over 400 new cadets in 3 years.
Instead of hiring the best candidate, they hired anybody who was just marginally acceptable. They just couldn't find enough quality candidates, and they went for quantity as opposed to quality.
Syntac 26 began surveillance, watching as the officers in question hung out together after hours, enjoying lifestyles far beyond the means of honest police officers. Marco Rivera was the suspected ringleader. Armando Garcia had recently become part owner of a bodybuilding gym. Osvaldo Coelho had just retired from the force. He was 30 years old, driving a $100,000 Lotus. It was easy to track their lavish spending.
One officer bought a home and built this pool, and he paid the developer cash. Showed up with a bag full of cash and gave it to him here for the purchase of my home.
Still, the detectives had little solid evidence.
Yeah, I'm in front of the restaurant. I don't see any marked units over here. But our boy is definitely over here having coffee with some friends outside, but I don't see any units.
They needed first-hand information, and they needed it soon. If these officers had already left at least 3 people dead, the detectives feared there could easily be more. 4 people had been murdered in Miami over a $27 million drug deal, gone bad. With so much money involved, the dividing line between the criminals and the cops blurred. The FBI offered their assistance to local law enforcement. Special Agent Robert Martin.
We began an investigation which became a joint investigation into whether there was some police corruption in the city of Miami.
Drug Task Force detectives with Syntac 26 had narrowed their investigation to a suspected group of corrupt Miami police officers. But the detectives needed inside information if they had any chance of cracking the case. They hoped they could get it from a reluctant police informer named Armando Un. They had already interviewed Un about the murder of his friend and partner, nightclub owner Luis Rodriguez. He seemed wary, perhaps afraid they too were dirty cops.
Hey, Armando, I want you to look at these photographs, see if you recognize anyone.
Detective George Plasencia tried to win his trust by showing photos of their surveillance of the suspect officers.
And he started looking through the photos, and he just paused. He dropped the photographs and shook her hand, and he says, "You guys are doing a good job. Let's sit down and talk."
But unfortunately, these things go wrong.
Un came down to Syntac 26, where he told Detective Alex Alvarez he figured he had nothing to lose.
He was scared. He thought, well, if I stick it out with the crooked cops, they were the ones that probably killed my partner. And he said, well, if they killed him, the next person to go is me.
In a marathon debriefing, he explained the origins of the rogue officers and their criminal enterprise. He said his friend and employer, nightclub owner Luis Rodriguez, had grown tired of the officers coming into his bar and shaking down his patrons for small amounts of drugs.
He wanted to make sure that his customers weren't bothered. So he first started paying the cops off not to come.
And you can maybe get a couple of gram arrests.
Soon he devised another plan that could make everyone some money.
You know, sometimes these things happen. It's just the nature of the business.
According to Un, Luis Rodriguez said to the officers, hey, you know what? Instead of arresting these people that are coming over here with petty drugs, why don't I set up deals, you know, maybe multi-kilo deals, more drugs involved. And when these people come over, I'll give you a description of their car, where they're coming from. You can stop them, steal their cocaine, bring it to me. I'll sell it. I'll give you a share.
The officers agreed.
What made this whole thing possible for these cops was they grew up and knew people who were in the drug trade. And that was the one aspect of what they had going for them.
Patrolman Marco Rivera ran the ripoffs. It seemed a perfect plan. The dealers would never incriminate themselves by reporting the thefts, and Rodriguez would always come through with the cash.
Get in the car. You have a good night now.
Un said the operation grew quickly, with more and more cops becoming involved. But they got greedy, wanting to do more rip-offs and bigger ones.
So the policeman said, okay, what's all good? And it all first began with...
Rodriguez introduced them to a second bar owner who knew of larger shipments.
Luis Rodriguez brought in another bar owner. He knew and he worked smuggling boatloads of drugs into the United States. And Rodriguez says, wait a minute, why stop at these 1 kilo, 2 kilograms of cocaine drug bust? Why don't we go for the boatloads and get 300, 400, 500 kilograms of cocaine at one shot?
Un didn't know about the raid where the 3 men drowned, but he did describe an earlier one the second bar owner had set up. A group of Miami officers had slipped aboard a boat at another marina, thinking the crew had left for the night.
Clear.
They knew exactly where the drugs were hidden. But during the unloading, they noticed the air conditioning was on. And suspected the crew was still on board, hiding. The crewmen surrendered. The raiders wasted no time disposing of the crew, as they had in the other raid. This time, no one drowned. All the men swam safely to shore. The cops finished up, then drove off with about 200 kilos of cocaine, valued at over $10 million. Armando Un confirmed the names of the officers involved, the very ones Sentak had been watching. Unfortunately, the investigators knew his credibility would be attacked in court.
Jury's not going to believe Armando Un, a self-proclaimed admitted drug trafficker, over, half a dozen or a dozen respected police officers. They're just not going to believe it. So we need more evidence.
What they needed was a confession on tape from the very cops they were investigating. They brought in the local bar owner from the drug raids and explained the evidence they had implicating him in the ripoffs. He reluctantly agreed to wear a wire and to meet with Officer Marco Rivera. But he said Rivera had been avoiding him for weeks, no doubt because of the Sentak 26 investigation. They would have to trick him into the meeting. Investigators hoped the results would be worth the risk. Detectives set up in a building across from a bar in the area Rivera patrolled and sent the informant inside. When surveillance units confirmed Rivera was nearby, detectives called 911 and reported a bar fight.
Send some officers down to 34th and 8th.
Officer Rivera drove up just as they planned. Rivera entered, looking for the alleged fight, but everything was quiet. The informant made his move. He told the officer he'd been subpoenaed by the U.S. Attorney's Office and wanted to know what to say. Rivera took the bait, but he didn't want to talk in front of witnesses. The corrupt cop spoke freely about his involvement in the drug operation.
So what's the real deal? Why are you worried?
So I can't Joey tell Winslow, yeah, he's dead. He ain't gonna talk. Unless they go in that courtroom with a Ouija board and no one say nothing, okay?
Rivera had no idea everything he said was being recorded. In Miami, investigators pursued a group of rogue police officers suspected of ripping off drug dealers and killing at least 3 of them. The detectives of Centak 26 finally managed to tape an incriminating conversation with the group's leader, Officer Rivera, as he talked about the raids, the drugs, the dirty cops. Detective Alex Alvarez.
It was key evidence because it was the corrupt police officer's own words about what he did, when he did it, and who he did it with.
The U.S. Attorney's Office in Miami reviewed the tapes. Assistant U.S. Attorney Russell Killinger knew they would need as much evidence as possible to convince a jury that several Miami law enforcement officers were behind the murders and thefts. The tapes provided a good start, but Killinger needed more evidence to implicate the other officers. Perhaps Armando Un could get it.
We wanted to get Un wearing a wire and talking to the other cops so that we get those other cops to confirm their own participation out of their own mouths.
Wearing a wire, Un met with Miami officers Marco Rivera and Armando Garcia. He told them that investigators were asking him questions about the boat raids. They warned him not to cooperate. He assured him Centak had nothing on any of them.
Listen, they all over me. They all over me.
They all over everybody. It doesn't matter. They ain't got nothing.
They don't have a damn thing on their face.
I don't want you guys to deceive.
But then they became suspicious, asking him if he was wired. That effectively halted all plans to record any more of the officers. But investigators were undaunted.
We decided to take more of an overt approach in the investigation and go to the next level, which was basically subpoenaing witnesses to the grand juries, issuing bank subpoenas for bank records and financial records.
Investigators began cataloging the assets of the suspects, including Marco Rivera's safety deposit box at a Miami bank. The box contained over $260,000 in cash, nearly 10 times his annual salary. Like Rivera, the other suspect officers left incriminating money trails.
The money was burning holes in their pockets, and they were going out and spending money left and right. They buy $20, $30, $40, $50,000 cars, cash. They bought homes valued in excess of $200,000, cash. They bought expensive furniture. They put down cash. Now, this is an officer who's making $30,000. We had an enormous amount of evidence.
The financial records, together with the taped conversations, were enough evidence for arrest warrants to be issued.
Expecting you guys.
2 days after Christmas 1985, Centak 26, Miami PD, and the FBI began the arrests. taking down 6 Miami cops, including the ringleader, Officer Marco Rivera. Officer Armando Garcia was also arrested without incident. Osvaldo Coelho and Emilio Rey surrendered in the following days. The trial began on September 29, 1986. Federal prosecutors thought they had a strong case.
We felt pretty good about the case. We'd gotten pretty much all the evidence in that we had hoped to get in.
Then, on January 21st, 1987, the jury came back with their verdicts.
I remember the judge just kept looking at the verdict forms, and he would look at one and put it down, and look at another and put it down, then pick up the other one and look at it again, and this went on for, it seemed like an eternity. And then he started shaking his head.
The jury was deadlocked, causing the judge to declare a mistrial. One juror had refused to deliberate. Investigators were stunned as all suspects were released.
That was really a low point in the investigation. We found out later, because the 11 jurors that voted for conviction were so convinced that these officers, because of all the evidence, were guilty, they started coming forward and saying, you know, we started getting contacted by friends and family members of these cops, offering us jobs and offering us money, and we knew that that was an attempt to try to get us to sway our votes.
The mistrial was an enormous setback. Detectives knew if they could not put these corrupt cops away, the people of Miami may never trust law enforcement again. A group of Miami officers were arrested and prosecuted for corruption, but chaos in the jury room resulted in a mistrial. All suspects were released.
They were thrilled that they weren't convicted. What they didn't realize, that it was probably a blessing in disguise for us, because all that did is give us more time, and we were more determined to find out more evidence against them, and that's exactly what happened.
The prosecutor and detectives were unwilling to give up. With so much at stake, investigators needed a break. They finally got one.
We found out that these officers had hired a hitman to kill Armando Un.
That hitman was Killer Joe Martinez. He confessed to being hired, hoping he'd get leniency for another crime he had committed.
We brought him in. He testified against the river cops. We were able to add more charges against them. And by that time, you know, the case was just becoming stronger and stronger and stronger and stronger, and they had nowhere to go, and then they started to fold and they started to cooperate.
The case finally broke wide open when one of the defendants, patrolman Emilio Rey, decided to confess. Through his lawyer, he had learned of the additional evidence against him. He hoped for sentencing leniency in exchange for his testimony.
He described to us some fairly bone-chilling conspiracies that had gone on and that were going on in an effort to try to kill the government witnesses.
All of the government's witnesses, especially Armando Un, were in danger. Investigators knew they had to use Patrolman Rey's confession to put more pressure on the other river cops. Facing the beefed-up federal case, ringleader Marco Rivera confessed.
He had implicated some 60 other City of Miami police officers in various criminal activities.
Unfortunately, Osvaldo Coelho and Armando Garcia fled the Miami area. 5 months later, an FBI informant said Coelho was hiding in the Bahamas. The FBI has no formal jurisdiction outside the United States, so it maintains legal attaché offices called legats in many foreign countries. They work as liaisons with each country's national police. The FBI liaison asked the Bahamian police for their assistance. They agreed to help get Coelho. Coelho was wanted for taking part in massive and deadly cocaine ripoffs in Miami. Investigators knew he had a broad network of friends he could ask for help. Coelho called one of them several times to arrange for assistance.
Yeah, I can help you. What do you need?
Okay, I can do that. Good. See you then.
What Coelho didn't know was that the FBI had already approached the friend, and he was working as an informant. The Bahamian police arrested Osvaldo Coelho without incident. He was extradited back to Miami to face charges of drug trafficking, conspiracy, and racketeering. Armando Garcia was the last of the rogue Miami cops still at large. On January 8, 1989, the FBI added Garcia to their 10 most wanted fugitives list. FBI Special Agent Robert Martin.
We don't pick our top 10 fugitives lightly. They have to be people that we consider to be a serious danger, not only to society, but to the very nature and fabric of what makes our country what it is. And one of those things is honest law enforcement services. Our Garcia was added to the list for that reason.
The FBI had evidence that Garcia may have fled to South America, but had few leads. Special Agent Robert Martin ran the public corruption squad that kept searching for the elusive fugitive.
Armando Garcia was uniquely qualified to understand what it was going to take to survive out of the country. Here was a police officer who knew every technique that we might use to find him or capture him. A guy that knew the difficulties moving in and out of foreign countries and doing investigations in those foreign countries. On top of that, you had a guy that had a lot of money. Yeah, I was just looking at these passports.
Garcia could be anywhere. For 4 years, agents looked into hundreds of leads with negative results. Then, in late 1993, the FBI got a tip. A friend was planning to visit the Garcia family in Colombia.
Okay, she didn't have it. I tell you, if you just make that call.
Agents worked with the Colombian police who followed the friend to an apartment in Cali. Agents believed that fugitive Armando Garcia was living there.
The Colombian National Police set up a surveillance with a number of units. It was going to be a 24-hour surveillance, and waited to see if they could identify anybody who would come out or travel around with her.
Three days later, they spotted Armando Garcia. The fugitive was caught off guard, unarmed.
Hold it, Garcia.
Garcia told them, said, I have $4,000 with me. You see the jewelry I have, you see my automobile, I have goods and belongings in my apartment. You can have all of that if you just let me go. And to quote the Colombian National Police official who came to Miami to describe events, they then told Armando Garcia, we're not the dirty cops, you are.
The last of the main suspects, Armando Garcia pleaded guilty to drug trafficking, racketeering, and tax evasion, and was sentenced to 25 years. When it was all over, 17 Miami officers were convicted for their involvement in the drug ripoff ring. It was the largest police corruption case in Florida history. In response to the scandal, the City of Miami Police Department formed its own internal investigations unit that targeted over 100 additional officers.
They obviously were suffering from all the media exposure and then the embarrassment of having numerous officers arrested, but I think it made them a stronger department. When you weed out the bad officers, you know, it just makes the good officers shine even brighter.